Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our UFMG Summer School in Brazilian Studies 2021. Um, this is our second day of the second week, and today is such um, very special day. Caterine, do you have a problem with
Não, Lu. Sua câmera está desligada.
my camera?
Yeah.
Well, weird. I can see myself. I'm sorry. Let me check it. Is it working now or no?
For me, no.
Can you see me, Marcos, for example?
Marcos.
No, Luciana, I can't see you, but I think we can
Yeah,
move forward.
I'm sorry. I'll move on. I'm very sorry for that. I can see myself. It's weird, but anyways, today's a very special day. We have at 2 p.m. We're going to have a visit to Yotin Museum. Yotin is such a special place here, very close to Belo Horizonte, to our city, right? And it's you really should come and see and visit us sometime because it's a very, very special place, an open doors museum. Today, you'll be able to get a hint, small hint, on how the museum is and some of the art pieces that we have there. And to start this wonderful day, we'll be delighted by Professor Corinne Davis Rodrigues in an insightful lecture on Brazilian society. And thank you very much for your presence. Such an honor to have you back, Professor Corinne. It's so nice to hear you talk and your lectures in the past, I guess, 2 or 3 years, right? That you're together with us, and we welcome you back. Thank you very much for being with us. And now the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. For those of you for whom it is morning, for those of you who is afternoon and evening, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Corinne Davis Rodrigues. I'm a professor in the sociology department, and I've been part of the Brazil Summer School program since it began in 2017. And I'm very glad to be back with you all this year. And so without ado, I will start up our presentation so that I can begin to give my talk. Can everyone see the screen? What I'm going to be talking about today, thank you. I can't see any of you, so I'm just going to trust that you all are still with me. What I'm going to be talking about today is Brazilian society. And that's a very, very broad topic. And so what I'm going to do is give a sort of a general overview of some of the key demographics. What is the composition of Brazilian society? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of Brazilian society. So to begin with, the question is, what does the Brazilian society look like? So I want to start talking about the composition by age and sex, and I'm using data from the 2010 census. We did not have the 2020 census last year, and we don't know when the census that will correspond to 2020 will actually take place. It was canceled last year due to the pandemic, and then it was not included in the budget for this year. Well, actually, there was money included in the budget for the census, but it was only 1/10 of the money that was expected to be needed for the census. And so the census was canceled this year. So all of us that are researchers and are very interested in knowing all of the characteristics of Brazilian society and how it changes over the years are crossing our fingers that the imposition, the Supreme Court has ordered that the census take place. And so hopefully next year, we will have a census. I'm currently in a project right now. Luciano talked about Inutim. Inutim is a museum that's in a rural part of the state of Minas, close to Belo Horizonte. And that's very close to a city called Brumadinho, an area that 2 years ago suffered a huge mining accident. We are doing some research in that area. And the fact that we don't have data from the 2020 census has actually become a problem. So some of the data that I'm going to be presenting are estimates from 2010, and we don't have good estimates for 2020 just quite yet. But that aside, in 2010, the Brazilian population was 211,774,184 persons. And we have a pretty even split between men and women. As you can see, we have slightly more women, slightly more men than women. And one of the things that is happening with the Brazilian population, this is the Brazilian population pyramid. And when we talk about demography and we talk about a pyramid, what we're trying to look at is what is the age composition of the population, and why does the age composition of the population have of interest to those of us that study Brazilian society? When we know what different populations of different ages have different needs. And so, for example, if you have a very young population that's under 15, you're going to have a population that needs public investment in education. If you have a population that is of working age, say 15 to 60, then you know that they're going to be generating revenue, generating tax income for the government, and that's going to be financing some of the other programs. When you have a population that has a larger percentage of older people, retired people, then that brings its own set of challenges, not only in terms of pensions and what would be the government paying of pensions, but also in increased health expenditures. And so one of the things that we notice in Brazil is that traditionally Brazil, like other Latin American countries, has had a very young population. And so if we look at this bubble, you know, it's called an age pyramid because initially the idea was you had more people that were on the younger side, so it would look more like a triangle. Now what's happening is we're looking at this and we can see that we're beginning to get more people in the older categories. And so this is a look at the difference between 2012 and 2019. And 2019 is the darker blue lines. And so you can see how in just 7 years, there have been an increase of older people within the Brazilian population. So what does that mean when we're studying Brazil, and how does that affect the society as a whole? This is a very good estimation of what the population pyramid in Brazil would look like. So the first one, it actually does look like a triangle. So this was 1975. And so in 1975, you can see really that you had a very large base of young people in the population. And then going down, you can look at what is the population pyramid looking like in 2000. And in 2000, you begin to see that there are fewer young people. So there are fewer babies being born to each woman, and people are living longer because there's a little bit more of a concentration at the top. The 2025 estimate is looking a little bit more like this one right here. Although the prediction is that there will be even more people on the top. And then the last pyramid is an estimation for 2050, that if the population rate in terms of how many people are dying, how many people are being born each year, and what is the life expectancy, the estimation is that we will begin to have a pyramid where we have fewer and fewer younger people, fewer and fewer school-age children because we have fewer and fewer births per year, and they're going to be larger life expectancies. Now, it will be really interesting to see to what extent the pandemic of the past year and this year does to life expectancy. There have been some estimates that for some populations, it's taken off a whole year of life expectancy. And so it'll be really interesting to see whether this prediction for 2025 and 2050 hold up. So why is there an aging in the Brazilian society? What Brazilian society is going through is something that has been happening in the United States and has been happening in Western Europe now for some time, and also in some of the Asian countries like Japan. And it's what we call in sociology and demography a demographic transition. And the demographic transition has two parts to it. The first part of the demographic transition is a decrease in infant mortality. And so you see from the first 50, 60 years of the 20th century, in Brazil, you had an increase in the young population. Why? Because people were having babies at the same rate, but fewer of those babies were dying. So fewer deaths in childbirth and fewer children dying at a very early age. And so the first piece of the demographic transition is you have an increase in the youth population. However, the second half of the demographic transition, and this is what we're seeing now happening in Brazil, is that the fertility rates begin to go down. So as women begin to have fewer children, you have fewer and fewer people in the bottom half of the pyramid, and you have larger groups of people in the adult and in the aged population, because those people are benefiting from the same technological advances that decreases infant mortality. It's also extending life expectancy. And so here we can see how would the birth rate change. So in 1960, the average number of children that a woman would have was 6.3. That's the average number. So you had women having 10, 12 children in Brazil in 1960. My son's father, for example, is one of 7 children, and he was born in 1973. So you can see, and so his mother was right there close to the average. Now, if you compare that to 2010, you have a dramatic decrease. And so in 2010, every woman of childbearing age was having on average 1.9 children. Now, obviously, there are going to be some children of childbearing age who never have children, and some women who have many more than that. That's why this is the average. And we can see that in 2015, this goes down even further. So what happened? And why was this fertility shift? Why did this fertility shift happen? And what's interesting in Brazil is that this fertility shift really begins to be marked starting in the 1970s. And so what happens is that in the 1970s, there is a push for access to birth control in Brazil. And so we see fertility rates go way down. Also in the 1970s, women begin to have more access to education and begin to go not just to elementary school and middle school, but also complete high school. And so that means that there was an average reduction of childbearing years. And so women that begin to have children later, because they waited until they finished school, are going to have fewer years to have children, and therefore they will have fewer children over average. And so these things begin to happen. And there was a very strong fertility shift in Brazil. And so you had higher rates of female education and greater participation of women in the workforce. So they were putting off that first child. And all of the data shows that the later that a person has their first child, the fewer children they'll have. And so that, coupled with access to birth control, resulted in a very marked shift beginning in the 1970s and 1980s that changed the fertility rates. And that has really transformed that pyramid. And so rather than having this very, very large young population, Brazilian society is beginning to look more and more like the patterns from Western Europe. This coupled with the fact that there's an increase in life expectancy. And so 1960, the life expectancy in Brazil was only 48 years. So the average Brazilian only lived until 48 in 1960. In 1980, only 20 years later, that had jumped to 61.7 years. And it has steadily increased. And so the latest data that I have to show you is 75.4. And I believe now we're right around 76, 77. Again, it'll be interesting to see whether the expected life expectancy decrease because of the pandemic continues, has any push past these 2 specific years of the pandemic. And so what was the reason for increased life expectancy? You had urbanization happening during this time. So you had improvements in sanitation, improvements in clean running water, and you had medical improvements and improvements to access to healthcare. And so all of these things increase the life expectancy. So all of these things contribute to an aging of the Brazilian society. So for a composition where we have fewer younger people being born and people living for more time. And so we're having a larger percentage of the population at 60 or more. Again, I think that it's going to be very interesting in the next 5 years to really see how the pandemic has changed these composition shifts, because as we know, the higher death rates from COVID-19 were of people over 60 and especially people over 80. So it'll be very interesting to see how this pyramid shifts over the next 5 years when we incorporate in the impact of the pandemic, which unfortunately in Brazil has been very high. So where do Brazilians live? So we have this composition in terms of age. And then one of the other interesting things about Brazil is the look at where people live and how has that changed over the years. And so one of the things that's very interesting about Brazil is that in the 20th century, and more specifically from about 1940 on, you have a very strong migration from rural areas in Brazil to urban areas in Brazil. There was a strong industrialization push that was begun in the 1930s and 40s and continued up until the 1970s. That drew a lot of laborers from the rural areas of Brazil to the larger cities in the southeast. And so we have really 3 different migration patterns. We have a pattern that happened up from 1970, where you had people moving into the large cities like São Paulo, like Rio de Janeiro, in order to work in large factories, like the automobile industry, like the steel industry. And then from 1970 to 1990, you have a little bit of a different pattern where people are moving into the interior of these states. And then from 2000 to 2010, we're seeing some migration patterns where people are moving back into the center west and into the north, primarily for large-scale agricultural endeavors. So this is a map of Brazil, and this shows the regions. So when I talk about the southeast, the north, the northeast, the center west, the south, you get a sense of what are the different states and different areas of Brazil that are related. I'm sorry, my dog is trying to get me to play ball with her like she does in every single Zoom meeting I ever have. And she's not taking no for an answer, so excuse my distraction. No, okay. So the north area, we're talking about Amazon, Paraná, Tocantins, and all of this area that's right around the northern border of Brazil. The northeast is this area here. The southeast has the cities of São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, where we are, Minas Gerais, Belo Horizonte, Espírito Santo. Oh, sorry. And the center west has Mato Grosso, has Brasília, and the south is Paraná, Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina. The northeastern part of Brazil, as we'll talk about in a little bit, was where most of the sugar plantations were. And so a large part of the slave trade and the slave plantations were in the northeast. Although Rio de Janeiro was the largest slave port in the Americas during the time of the slave trade. The south of Brazil has a larger percentage of European migration, and the north of the country has a larger percentage of indigenous peoples. And so that gives you sort of a sense. We're going to talk a little bit more about race and ethnicity as I go further on. So one of the things that's interesting, I talked about this first wave, this first migration pattern. And the first migration pattern up to 1970 was really an urbanization of Brazil. And so you can see that by 1980, 70% of Brazil was already urban. And in the next 30 years to 2010, that goes up even higher. And so now, almost 90% of all Brazilians live in some urban center, so in some city, in some municipality. Whereas in 1980, a little over 30% of Brazilians lived in a rural area. Now, a little more than 10% live in these areas. Prior to this, if we were to go back to 1930 and 1940, you would see that about 70% of Brazil lived in rural areas. Okay, go lie down. And only 30% lived in urban areas. So one of the things that's very interesting up to 1970 was an absolute switch of urban to rural population. So if we look at 1960 to 2010, what we have here is who was gaining and who was losing people based on migration patterns from 1960 to 2010. So if we look at the very first piece of this, you see that in 1960, which is the very first line, the lightest line on the far left, you see that the north, the southeast, and in particular São Paulo, the south, and in the south, Paraná, and the center west, from 1960 to 1970, those were the places where they were gaining people. So people were moving to the north, moving to the southeast, moving to São Paulo, moving to the center west. Why were they moving to the center west? Well, that was exactly the time in the construction of Brasília, and Brasília is in the center west, so that explains a bit about that. You can see where they came from. Most people were leaving in the 1960s. You had people leaving the northeast, so people leaving the rural northeast, moving into more urban areas looking for work. And you had people leaving Minas Gerais. That's very common. Minas Gerais traditionally has had a lot of people leave because the opportunities for work, even though Minas has had a tradition of mining and has also had some industrialization with Fiat and other places, it can't compare with the large-scale industrialization and the large-scale job opportunities available in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. So Minas traditionally has been a feeder of migration and not a receiver of migration. And we can see that through every single one of the time points. So 1960, 1970, 1980, and 1990 and 2000. The Northeast, the same thing. Every single period of migration, we see that the Northeast is losing people. So people are leaving the Northeast for better opportunities in other countries, in other spaces. And we see this most specifically, Sao Paulo being the large receiver of most of these spaces. And so you see that the Southeast is a large feeder. The North becomes more important in these patterns of migration in 1970 and 1980 with larger agricultural products or larger agricultural industry. Now, one thing is this push where you have more people moving from rural areas to urban areas. And what does this do to urban centers? Now, one of the things that's interesting to look at, and this is one of the things that I tend to spend a lot of time studying, is exactly what are the characteristics of Brazilian urbanization? How is it that people are distributed within the cities? And if you visit any urban center, and Belo Horizonte would be no exception to this, you'll see substantial differences in population density. So you have areas where a lot of people are congregating, and you have neighborhoods where people are a little bit more spread out. And you also have differences in city services. Now, this isn't any different from any other city in any other part of the world. What makes it specific to Brazil? One of the characteristics of Brazilian urbanization is that the social segregation, these differences among census tracts. So you have some census tracts where people are very, very wealthy and they live in high-rise apartment buildings and they have very good plumbing and water service. Whereas you'll have other census tracts where the housing is not regulated and the dwellings are very, very close to each other, and all of the sanitation and water and electricity has been acquired informally. Now, unlike European and North American cities, the way that these census tracts have grown up, there's not going to be a lot of geographical distance between them. So one of the theories of urbanization that characterizes a lot of North American urbanization and European urbanization has to do with this idea of urban ecology, and this idea that you're going to have zones of different activities in an urban area. And so you're going to have a very dense urban city center that's mostly industrial or trade or commerce related. And then you're going to have concentric circles of zones outside of that city center. And that's going to be where there are different dwellings. And the more affluent you are and the more money you have, the further away from this very busy, dense, industrial, commercial city center you're going to live. And so you have this idea of moving out into the suburbs, and then because the people who move out to away from the city center are more affluent, they bring with them infrastructure of roads, schools, sanitation, water, electricity, etc. Brazilian urbanization is completely different from that. Brazilian urbanization has a city center where the affluent live so that they can be close to the commerce and the culture and the transportation. And then around this city center, in a very haphazard way, are dwellings and neighborhoods that develop in a not regulated sense. And so, for example, you'll see areas of what we call here in Belo Horizonte villas, or what are known in other areas as favelas, which would be areas where people have occupied land, built their own dwellings, and taken plumbing and electricity and sanitation from areas that are contiguous to it and then built in those sorts of structures. And so one of the striking things about Brazilian cities is that you often see very, very wealthy, well-serviced areas of the city right next to areas that are lacking in all of these things. And so you have a social segregation that is much more, is on a much smaller scale. So you're not going to have an entire region or an entire neighborhood of a city that is poor. You're going to have pockets of rich and poor. And one of the best illustrations of this in Belo would be looking at some of the different regions. And so this is a map of Belo Horizonte, and it shows the different regions of the city. And so you have, we're right here, or we would be right there if we were on campus, we would be in Pampulha. And so you can see the lake. You can see the lake here in Pampulha. The lake's not on here, but it would be right here. And so the university would be right about here. And what you can see is that where are people more densely concentrated? They're more densely concentrated here in the west, the center south, right here on the border with another city, and in the center south. And so this area here of the center south and the west and the east is the richest part of Belo Horizonte. That's more center. That's the part that was the original part of the city. You have this area of Venda Nova being very dense due to the fact that it's next to another city, and this ends up being where people can live that want to travel in and work downtown. And so it ends up being somewhat of a sleeper feeder neighborhood. This image right here is, let me show you, is right about here, I would say. It's called the Barragem Santa Lúcia. And one of the reasons that I really like this image, and when I have people who come, you know, sometimes I host people when we do projects on urban development, I like to take them here because what you have here is you have Santa Lúcia, which is a favela. It's a very poor neighborhood. And you can see, even from this aerial image, how different the housing is and what the density of the housing is here versus on this other side of this little lake right here, which is actually a dammed up part of one of the rivers. And so what you have, which makes it very interesting in terms of studying urbanization, and not only studying urbanization, but in my case, studying sort of belongingness in neighborhoods and territory, is that this area here is a park. And so you have a mix of people who live here who want to go to the park and people who live here who want to go to the park. And so occasionally there are discussions about who the park belongs to, what are the right people to be at the park. And it's one of the ways that you can really sort of see how differences in that these people live basically in the same neighborhood, but they live two very, very distinct realities. And so this shows you quite a bit of difference in how you have social segregation that's very, very evident, because you can see that the dwellings are very, very different. The access to sanitation, the access to trash services, electricity, et cetera, is very different. But in terms of geographical proximity, these two neighborhoods are very, very, very close together. And so that's one of the features of Brazilian urban areas. And this has a lot to do with the fact that when all of these people came in the 1960s and 70s and 80s to work, there was no coordinated political policy about creating housing. So other cities other cities in other countries have different ways of dealing with an influx of population. They might allow landlords to build large tracts of land, and so you have, these supposed slumlords in the United States who had all of these tenement houses where the poor people would go to work. In Brazil, you didn't have that kind of public policy. So what you had was areas of the city where there wasn't any development. And so people took that over and began to build on their own land. And that's something that continues today. And it's one of the things that is always an issue in urban public policy. Public policy is, how do we deal with occupations? How do we deal with people who have no place to live, and then they take over a place to live? And then what are the implications of that, and how does the city deal with that? In my own neighborhood, for example, I live in Castelo, which is, let me show you, I live sort of on this part of Pampulha. We had an apartment building that went up about a block from my house, and it was about 7 or 8 story apartment building, and it never was finished. I don't know what happened. I don't know if they lost their financing. I don't know what happened, but they basically left this shell of an apartment. And it wasn't very long until some people moved in, and they ran some electric lines in so that they could get electric power. You would see shortly some satellite TV dishes go up, kids playing and hanging of clothes. And so they lived there for quite some time, and it was pretty full. And then unfortunately, 2 years ago, I don't know how it began, but there was a big fire in that apartment building, which isn't really an apartment building. It was just the concrete shell of the apartment building that people had begun to live in. And so then everyone had to be evacuated from this apartment building because it caught on fire, and it took about a day for it to get under control. And then the city came in, and they had places for all these people to go. So then the question is, where did they go? What do they do? What is the city's response to some of these occupations? And so that's something that happens. And now currently that building, the shell of the building, has not been reappropriated for anything. But that's just one example of how a lot of the urban policy in Brazil in different cities happens from the fact that you have people that either don't have access to housing, and then they make their own housing. And what are the implications of that? So part of the way that we have this drastic image of rich and poor very, very close together has a lot to do with the way that the city has developed and the way that housing policy has or has not really dealt with the need of a certain class of people. For a very, very long time in Brazil, for example, with inflation, it was very, very hard for people to get loans for housing. And so the housing market was geared very much towards people who could pay outright for their houses. And you had a few programs, and one of the programs that's happening now is Minha Casa Minha Vida, which allows for people to have low-cost loans for housing. And so you see some of the different policies that are happening to try and counteract some of these occupations and some of the ways that urban policy has created certain situations based on fallow land. This shows a little bit of the housing density, the population density. And so you can see where you have more density from 2006. So this is 2006, 2010, 2012, 2014. And you can see really that the spaces don't really change that much. So in terms of where people are living and where the denser parts and the more affluent parts of the city are, they continue to be in this area here, and then in some sense around this area here. Now, I said I would talk a little bit about the ethnic composition, because when I went and spoke a little bit about the different regions of Brazil, the Northeast, the Southeast, the South, the Central West, I talked a little bit about their historic, their histories and how that has influenced their ethnic composition. And so basically, Brazil is composed of three main ethnic groups. You have Europeans, you have Africans, and you have indigenous people. And the Europeans are primarily Portuguese, but you also had influence of French, Dutch, German, Italian, and Spanish over time. And so, for example, the Dutch had a colony in Pernambuco in the Northeast area, and so you have still some Dutch. Germans came in more to the south, as did the Italians. Brazil received, during the Great Migration of Italians and Irish and other immigrants in the very beginning of the 20th century, Brazil also received a fair amount of European immigrants, most notably Italian immigrants. Secondly, you have, because of the African slave trade, Portugal had colonies, mostly in Mozambique and Angola, but also in Cabo Verde. And so most of the slave trade, most of the African slave trade that came into Rio was coming mostly from East Africa. And then additionally, you have indigenous peoples. There are over 350 different ethnic groups, and these speak more than 270 languages. So those are the three main groups. And so there's a discussion that Brazil, every Brazilian has a little bit of each of these different elements in their DNA. In the 20th century, you had other ethnic groups migrating to Brazil. So the Japanese have a long migration history from 1908 until 1960. And this primarily was because with the end of slavery in Brazil, which happened in the 1880s, you had the need for more labor, especially in the farms in Sao Paulo. And so you had, that's where the influx of Italians came in. And that was also, there was an agreement to bring over Japanese to work on farms, primarily in the Sao Paulo region. You also have other ethnic groups, such as Arabs, especially those from Lebanon and Syria. You have an influx of Chinese and Korean, and more recently, other South Americans. So in the more recent years, I would say from the 1980s, 1990s, you have other South Americans, Peruvians, Bolivians, Argentines. So we have this idea that Brazil is primarily Portuguese, East African, and indigenous, but really there's a lot of different ethnicities in Brazil. And we see some of that actually in the food. For example, sushi has become very, very commonplace. In any sort of snack store or snack shop, you're going to find Arab food. So you're going to find kibe and esfihha. And so there's other things that have incorporated themselves into sort of the national cuisine and national conversation that people might be surprised, oh, there's all these other things in Brazil. I spoke about this discussion of Brazilians being primarily the ethnic and racial composition being primarily a mix of Portuguese, East African, and indigenous. And one of the things that's very interesting, and you all will have or have had already a lecture specifically on race, but I'm going to talk about race and ethnicity a little bit and how it affects the composition of the society. And one of the things that's very interesting when we talk about race and ethnicity in Brazil is that Brazil is another large country in the Americas that had a very large slave trade and very large slave population, and then had, with the end of slavery, an incorporation of this population into the general public. And it's very interesting to try and compare Brazil with other countries, most specifically the United States, but some comparisons are done with South Africa as well, about how does Brazil deal with or not deal with this legacy. And so one of the big questions is, well, how is race even measured in Brazil? And one of the things that's interesting is that for a very long time, there was never any really discussion of race. And so we have racial categories in the demographic census happening for the very first time in 1872. And here we have a discussion of, a distinction. So we have white, black, mestiça, cabocla, and those were for the free population. So cabocla would be a mix of indigenous and white, and mestiça would be a mix of black and white. And then you had a different classification for the slave population, which would be brown and black. So you had lighter or darker slaves. And then you don't really have any discussion of race in the census until 1940. So, once the Lei Áurea is proclamated and slavery ends in Brazil in the 1880s, there's this idea that, oh, there's no race in Brazil, we're multiracial. And so there's no need to even measure race. And then it is until the 1940s that you really have a discussion again about, well, let's look at racial classifications. And in this case, they use three: white, black, and yellow. Okay, white would be Caucasian, black would be Brazilians of African descent. And so what would yellow be? Well, yellow is the term used for Brazilians of Asian descent. Yes, I know it's horrible and it exists today, but that is the question, that is the classification that is used. And then this continued until 1960, when they began to introduce this idea of brown. So brown would be a classification for somebody who wouldn't classify themselves as white and wouldn't classify themselves as black. And then in 1991, you have a inclusion of an indigenous category. And so what we have in Brazil when the census measures race is we have 4 colors, and then we have this category indigenous. And in truth, what we have is a mix in the same question of race and ethnicity. So we have this idea of white, black, brown, yellow, which technically would be Asian Brazilians. So that would actually be an ethnicity as opposed to a race, and then indigenous category. These categories, nobody likes these categories. I don't know a demographer that likes these categories. However, all of the attempts to try and change these categories haven't really gained any consensus. And so, for example, there was a test that was done in one of the surveys that's done in between the censuses, and they did it as an open question. So they asked people, what is your race or color? And they got 264 different answers. And so you've got answers like coal black and blue black and morena and cinnamon and, all different kinds of colors. And so they haven't really had a way of really looking at this. Some people are using the term moreno in some of the tests that have been done to try and see if we can come up with different categories. Instead of using brown, they're using the word moreno. And what they found is that moreno is a term that people self-identify more readily than brown. And so what happens is if you ask the same people in the same survey, are you white, black, brown? Are you white, black, moreno? What you have is that some of the people who said they were white in the white, black, brown option will say they're moreno. And some of the black people in the white, black, brown will say they're moreno. And so, there hasn't been a sense of whether moreno will really work. And one of the other things that's been really interesting about these racial categories is that traditionally you saw people classify themselves as brown or white rather than black. But now we see that there is a education and an age effect. And so people who are more highly educated now are more likely to call themselves black than before. And also people who are young are more likely to identify in the category black as before. So there's some discussion about whether there is the growth of a identity, of a black identity in Brazil. So here is the current, using those classifications that nobody likes, but everybody has to use because that's what we have. You have white, black, yellow, brown, and indigenous. And so this is, now in the census people ask, they say, how do you identify? So it's self-identity, it's self-determined. And so in 2000, you had 53.7% of the population identified as white. And this went slightly down to 47.3% in 2010. And we had slightly more people identifying as black in 2010 than in 2000, and more people identifying as brown. So part of that is actual population growth. So you have larger percentages, but you also have some sense that more people are identifying, fewer people are identifying as white and more people are identifying as brown or black. If you look at the regions, and this is why I made that notification before about the regions, talking about the fact that because of the different histories of the regions and because of the different migration patterns in the regions, you have different racial distribution to this day. And so the first one is showing what is the racial distribution in Brazil as a whole. So the racial distribution in Brazil as a whole, you see you have slightly more people identifying as white, and then a large percentage identifying as brown. And then that pink stripe in the middle is people who identify as black, and that little tiny green stripe are the yellow or Asian Brazilians. And then the dark green, which you don't even see really in the look as Brazil as a whole. Funny, they're switched. And so in the next one, it says north, but it's actually the northeast. You can see that it has the largest percentage of both black it has the largest percentage of black and a larger percentage of brown and a smaller percentage of white. When you look at the third column, which says northeast, but the map says it's north, that's the only space where you really see a visible segment of the population as indigenous. And so you can also see that there's a large brown population, a much smaller white population overall. So the north has the smallest white population overall, which contrasts very much to the south. And so in the south, you see that the darker blue line, which is white, is much, much more. And in the southeast, where we are, what do you have? You have a slightly larger population is white. And then you have between black and brown and yellow, you have about 45% of the population. And in the center west, you also have a smaller white population, smaller even, but slightly larger than the north and the northeast. In Belo Horizonte, for example, if you add up the black and the brown, it makes up slightly more than half, so about 52%. So Belo Horizonte is a minority majority city. So beyond age composition and beyond race composition, one of the other interesting things that we look at in society is to look at religion in Brazil. And the Brazilian census is going to divide religion into 5 groups. So it's going to identify Catholics, evangelicals, which would be Protestant, and then they're classified as traditional and Pentecostal. Espírita, which is a religion that has Eastern origins, African religions, which are practiced such as Candomblé and Umbanda, and then everything else gets pushed into this category of other religions. So that is anything from Judaism to Muslim to Hare Krishna, everything else. And then a discussion, and then a category for no religion. And one of the things that's been interesting in Brazil is that we've seen 2 things happen over time. First is the percentage of people who identify as evangelicals has increased over time, and that is the same sort of Pentecostal and Protestant wave that has happened in other Latin American countries. And then you see the category of no religion also increase over time, which is another trend that follows trends worldwide of secularization. And so this shows you a little bit of what is the distribution of the population based on declared religion. And so this is looking at census data from 1960 to 2010. And so you can see in 1960, the line at the top, almost everybody was Catholic. So you're looking at 92% of the population declared itself Catholic. And you had this teeny, teeny, tiny bit, the little triangle is Protestant, less than 10% saying, identifying as evangelical. And then this without religion, which is the little square one, and the Espírita, you can't even see them in 1960. And so in 1970, so what happens over time is that the amount of people who declare themselves Catholic sharply falls, and it sharply falls beginning really in the 1980s and pushing through 1991 and 2000. Oh, just a clarification. When I'm doing all of these census data, you might be asking yourself, why is it 1991 and not 1990? This is not the first time we've had a president say that the census isn't worth having. President Collor in 1990 also said, we're not going to do the census. Fortunately, he changed his mind, and he was forced to change his mind, and so we did a census in 1991. So I imagine that when I do this again in 10 years, it's going to be 1991, 2000, 2010, 2022, and I'm going to have to explain why we had census in 2022. But yes, so that's why it's 1991 and not 1990, because we did have another instance of another president who decided not to fund the census. But what you do see with this change, so in 2010, you go from over 95% of the population saying that they're Catholic to about 70%, little less than 70%. And you see really a rapid rise starting in the 1990s of Protestants. And so now, 2010 data, you're looking at about 20%. And I would imagine that if we had data from the 2020 census, hopefully 2022 census, we're going to have an even larger jump. And you also see an increase of people saying that they don't have religion. So that little square one in 2010 is almost 10% of the population. So you have a secularization happening in Brazil, and you see other religions beginning to show up. So Espírita begins to have a little bit more space and begin to show up as something like 2, 3, 4% of the population. What's really interesting about about religion in Brazil is that these religions that are beginning to gain followers. So if you look at, for example, Protestant religion and Espírita, which have had increases in the past 20 years, 20, 30 years, they have very different socioeconomic compositions. And so Espíritas, people who declare themselves Espíritas tend to have higher education levels and higher income levels than average Brazilians. And people who declare themselves Protestant evangelicals tend to have lower levels of education and lower levels of income. The Protestant religions made the strongest gains among the lower levels, populations with lower levels of income and lower levels of schooling. And that's the pattern that we see in other countries in Latin America as well. So what are two of the characteristics about religion in Brazil? One of them, the rise of evangelical religions, isn't very different from other countries in Latin America. So you have a rural-urban division. Much of the gain in evangelical religions happens in the urban areas and not in the rural areas. The rural areas continue to be predominantly Catholic. There's an economic bias of Pentecostalism. So part of the Pentecostal message has to do with economic advancement. And you see more and more people, a larger percentage of people who identify as Pentecostal coming from segments of the population with lower incomes, and having its strongest rise in the 1980s and 1990s. And I would even add to this that in the case of Brazil and the rise of evangelical religions, the evangelical religions are much more politically engaged than the Catholic Church. And we see that with pastors running for office, either for city council or for senator. And even just yesterday, the person who the president has indicated as a replacement for the member of the Supreme Court that is going to retire in September, he made a point of accentuating the evangelical background of this particular nominee to the Supreme Court. And that he's going to be, and he had said before that the nominee to the Supreme Court was going to be terribly evangelical. And so that's just one more anecdotal evidence of the power in the political engagement of evangelicals. The other characteristic of religion in Brazil, and this is much more Brazilian and isn't as shared with other countries in Latin America, is this ideal of pluralism and syncretism. And there's a strong blending of beliefs and rituals. So, for example, someone will say will identify as Catholic, but they may practice certain beliefs and rituals that are associated with African-based religions. So, for example, the one ritual that's very, very popular in Brazil is to wear white on New Year's Eve. And that has to do with the goddess Iemanjá. And there's an idea that you need to go into the ocean and jump 7 waves and give an offering to Iemanjá, and that will give you good luck through the new year. And many people practice this ritual who would not identify themselves as practicers or believers in candomblé. They wouldn't identify themselves as practitioners of African-based religions. They would say they're either Catholic, predominantly they would say they're Catholic or don't have religion. There's less syncretism and less pluralism between evangelicals and African or spirited African-based religions. We did a survey of the city of Belo Horizonte a few years back, and one of the questions in the survey was we asked people if they believed in a lot of different things. And so we had one core that was like, do you believe in God? Do you believe in angels? Do you believe in heaven and certain things? And then we had other things, you know, do you believe in demons? Do you believe in UFOs? Do you believe in ghosts? And it was really interesting that the people that believed in sort of the core sort of Christian beliefs also believed in a whole bunch of other things. You know, they believed in, you know, fairies and UFOs and all sorts of other things. And so one of the characteristics of Brazilian religion is this fluidity between basically, I'm going to take all the help I can get. So I will, you know, if I want to get married, for example, let's say that I'm concerned about getting married and finding my true love. So I might do some sort of ritual that's linked up to Saint Anthony, who is the patron saint of marriage. But I also might do something that pays homage or tries to get the favor of a god in either Umbanda or the Candomblé traditions. And so this sort of idea of I'll pray to anybody who will help me out. And that there not being really any sanctions for that. The difference is that this syncretism and pluralism is less prevalent among evangelicals, although it's still there, than it is among people who either identify as Catholic or don't identify with any religion or identify as spiritual. So those are sort of the two characteristics when we're looking at differences in religion in Brazil. What I want to talk about towards the end of my talk is, now we've talked about what is the age composition, what is the racial composition, what's the religious composition, and I spoke a little bit about the distribution of the urban population and how the way that the population is distributed in urban areas highlights some of the social segregation and inequality in terms of services. But really, I would say one of the main characteristics of Brazilian society would be the high degree of inequality. So one of the things that really stands out is how marked the differences are in development in regions and social groups. And one of the ways internationally that we measure inequality is through the Gini index. And so the Gini index looks at the proportion between the richest population and the poorest population in the country. And so you want a very low score. You want there to be not as, if you have less inequality in your society, then more people are equal. So there's less of a difference between the very, very rich and the very, very poor. And so if we look at, you know, what was the Gini index in 2001, it was 55.3. And in 2014, that had dropped considerably to 49.7. In the first 10 years, basically 2000 to 2010, 2012, Brazil had a period of very high economic growth. There was a commodities boom, and so the beef and the coffee and the oranges and the soy and all of these things that Brazil produced were highly sought after in the international market. That created a lot of revenue for Brazil. And the president at the time in 2002, President Lula, had an agenda of creating more opportunities for a larger degree of Brazilians. And so there was a program of wealth distribution called Bolsa Familia, which had existed before 2002, but was accelerated and incorporated and consolidated. There was a large push for an increase in the number of federal universities and the amount of people who could go to them, as well as a scholarship program for people to get into private universities. So there was a big push to democratize and make university education more accessible. That was also when different housing projects I talked about, Minha Casa Minha Vida, which was a loan program specifically targeted toward lower income Brazilians so that they could buy houses. And so with all of these things, and these were financed primarily through the fact that Brazil was really living a commodities boom. And so we did see over time, over the next 10 years or so, a drop in the Gini index, and so a decrease in inequality. By 2014, Brazil had really entered into a recession, which steepened in 2016 and 2017. And that gave rise to the need for a lot of austerity in terms of government spending. And so we see the inequality in Brazil increasing in 2017 to 53.3. And country comparison to the world actually is about 19th, or about the 19th most unequal country. And that has increased with the pandemic. So we had a high unemployment rate in 2019 going into the effects of the pandemic. And now we're seeing inequality markers that we haven't seen for the past 20 years. For example, we're seeing food insecurity gone up in a way that it hadn't for the last 20 years. We're seeing unemployment staying at very, very high levels. And we're beginning to see creeps in inflation in terms of goods and services. So we're entering into a point where the inequalities in Brazilian society are beginning to become even more and more marked. And that was intensified. We had the gains in combating inequality that had happened over the first 10 years of the 21st century were beginning to be lost before the pandemic, and the pandemic has even accelerated that. And just to give you a sense, this is census data from 2010. And what we have here is the first one on the left is a map that shows the composition, shows the percent white. And so the areas that are most red have the highest composition of white inhabitants in Belo Horizonte. So this is a map of Belo Horizonte. And so you can see that, again, you have high levels of white here in the center south. So this is the richest area. And then down here, you also have higher levels of white. This map shows income. So the red are the higher income areas, and the blue are the lower income areas. So here, the blue means the lowest percentage of white per census tract, and the red is the highest percentage of income. And what you find is that the same areas, these central areas, with high levels of white concentration in census tracts, also have the highest levels of income. The only outlier in 2010 is this area here, this Barreiro area here, where you have higher percentage is white, but this is a lower middle class income area. And that's actually one of the things that I was working on with the project comparing Belo Horizonte with Houston. Why is this different than this area here? What's going on in this area? And we really need 2020 data because this effect of 2010 could really be this lowering in income inequality. And we need to be looking at 2020 data to see whether or not the economic recession, which happened about the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, did that mean that we had people moving out of these areas now? How did this impact their income levels? So did these people move into this area when they were doing better in the beginning of the 2006, 2008, and then now they're not doing so well in 2010? But one of the other things that was most striking for us when we were looking at this data was really that if you live in a white neighborhood, you live in a rich neighborhood. And if you live in a non-white neighborhood, you live in a poor neighborhood. And that was pretty consistent. You can overlay these maps and see pretty much the same patterns. So how is racial inequality, if we're going to recognize that there really is a link between race and income or race and economic opportunity, how has this discussion happened in Brazil? Now, remember I said that for the longest time, the census didn't even ask race. And so we've had an evolution in Brazil about this discussion of racial inequality. And in the 1930s, there was an understanding that Brazil is multiracial. It's a racial democracy. We don't have race. And all of the inequality, where it exists, is due only to class. And so the academics in the 1930s and 1940s really didn't see that there was income inequality due to racial discrimination. They were really focused on class. It's like, no, the person is poor. The person doesn't get the job because they're poor, or the person is discriminated against because they're poor. It doesn't have anything to do with their skin color, because Brazil is racial democracy. And there was a lot of push to try and see Brazil as this racial democracy. Everybody's mixed up, and there's no distinction. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that interracial marriage was not as big a taboo and wasn't illegal in the same way that it was, say, in the United States. And so the fact that there was interracial marriage and a lot of children of mixed race led to this idea that, oh, Brazil is a racial democracy. Well, it's not until really the 1950s that there's a beginning of discussion that there could be racial inequality. Well, maybe it's, there's actual discrimination going on. But there was no consensus about it. There was a beginning of a discussion that, yes, poor areas, neighborhoods that are Black are neighborhoods that are poor. So there was a recognition that there might be an association, but there was really no consensus that there was actual racial discrimination, that people were not getting into schools, or were not getting jobs, or were not getting promotions because of racial discrimination. And that was why we had these racial inequalities. So in the 1970s, you begin to have new studies that are beginning to actually show evidence of racial inequality. So they're looking at the fact that you have fewer Afro-Brazilians finishing high school, that Afro-Brazilians have poorer health outcomes, that they make less money in the labor market, and they're beginning to control for class. So they're beginning to control for, parents' occupation and so forth. And they're showing, no, it really has to do with race. We can separate race from class, and race is an actual component that is leading to this inequality. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, and continuing on to today, we're beginning to actually have studies that are trying to actually determine Okay, what is the weight of race in this unequal insertion of Blacks, specifically in education and the labor market? So they're trying to actually show, okay, what can be attributed to race and what can be attributed to other factors, and are really beginning to quantify the level of discrimination of Afro-Brazilians in both the education and the labor markets. And this is what led to, in the 2000s, the end of the 1990s and in the 2000s, to the adoption of racial quotas in public higher education. And so it was because of studies that were really beginning to quantify, no, there's actual inequalities that are based on discrimination and lack of opportunities. And so the idea of racial quotas in Brazil that began at the end of the 1990s are a way to try and ameliorate some of these unequal insertions in education and the labor market. The other large area of inequality, and it's been an area that I've looked at a bit, has to do with how does the criminal justice system see Afro-Brazilians and how are they treated? And so in criminal justice, we really do see, in the same way that the educational and labor markets, you really do see differences in, first, the risk of violence, and second, the difference in police supervision, and thirdly, differences in incarceration. So I'm going to finish my talk talking a little bit about these inequalities in Brazilian society, which due to some of the things that happened last year in the United States, began to be looked at more. But we've had issues here in Brazil. We've had a series of police shootings of bystanders who were Black that had been questioned. There was a very famous case about towards the end of last year, of a Black man who was stopped violently and killed by security guards in a supermarket because they thought that he had stolen something. And so there have been a series of cases of police supervision that has led to a fatality in Brazil. Very similar in some ways to the George Floyd case, but with different outcomes. We've not had, in no way have we had the court or the sentencing that happened with the George Floyd case that happened just a few months ago. So I want to talk a little bit about that differential in inequality. So these are data from 2017, and they show what is the homicide rate for each Brazilian state. And different than you may think, all the violence is not happening in Rio de Janeiro and not happening in Sao Paulo, at least not anymore. In the 1990s, that was very much the case. Now you can see that really it's the North and the Northeast that have the highest rates. And so these are homicide rates by 100,000. So 68 out of 100,000 people. And then Minas Gerais is way down here, 19.6. And one of the things that has happened in 2019 and last year is we've had an increase in the homicide rate. It hasn't been as big of a jump that the United States has been experienced, but we have had a jump, an increase in the homicide rate 2019 and then last year a little bit. And so here, this sort of gives you the map of this. Where are the highest rates? The highest rates currently are in the North and the Northeast. And the lower rates now are São Paulo and Santa Catarina and the District Federal, so Brasília. So places in the Southeast and the South, which decades before had higher rates, are now some of the lowest rates. However, the rates in all the states have gone up in recent years. And so who is dying? Who are the victims of homicide? And the victims of homicide are primarily young people, 15 to 29 years. And so this is a graph that shows the increase in homicides. So this starts in 1996, and you can see that we had very, very high rates here, and then this goes until 2016. So if you're a young person, we had a dip here in the 2000s, and then you can see that the homicide rate for young people has increased substantially from about 2011. It keeps going up. And the victims of homicide are usually Afro-Brazilian. So this actually puts together both Black and brown and compares it with white. And so you can see that the homicide rate for someone who's white has been pretty steady. However, we see that from 2010 on, we're seeing a steady climb. First of all, there's a large differential. So about 15 in 100,000 white people are victims of homicide compared to about 32 out of 100,000 Afro-Brazilians. And then this keeps going up. And so when there's discussion in the media of Black genocide, these are the sorts of things that they're referring to. They're referring to higher rates of murder of Afro-Brazilians compared to white Brazilians. Where is policing happening? So you have more policing in urban areas that have larger concentrations of Black and brown residents. So if we go back to this map, the policing is happening here, and it's happening here, and it's not happening so much right here. So and that contributes. And then if we look at some of the cases of police and military occupations in neighborhoods, we had a case at the beginning of this year in a neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro where they came in to serve warrants, and there was a very, very large shootout, and over 20 people were killed. And there's a lot of discussion in that particular operation of how it happened and how did they come in to serve the warrants. Why did they come in so heavily armed? Why were some people killed inside of residences? Why were there moving of bodies? There were some cases where there was alleged repositioning of the body, multiple gunshot wounds of people who didn't have weapons. And so there's a discussion of how these operations are carried out. Why are they going in with such force? Why are the casualties so high? And that's also part of the discussion with some of the, there have been a spate of 2 or 3 or 4 situations where people have died. You know, there have been situations where people have died from stray bullets in police operations. And then the question is, why are police shooting first and asking questions later? Why are they shooting into large crowds? Why are they shooting at cars that are speeding away? And so what is the police presence in certain neighborhoods, and how are police interacting with populations in these neighborhoods? And this is not a new problem. This is not a since 2019 problem. But especially in the case of Rio de Janeiro, you had a governor who was elected in 2018, who has since been impeached for misusing health funds for the pandemic, who had a rhetoric that the police need to be strong and tough and shoot first and ask questions later. And in Brazil, the police that are on the street, that police the street and that investigate crimes, they are not city police, they're state police. And so the policies come from the governor's office. And so there was a discussion about how that contributed to some of these policies of occupations and very, very deadly rates. In 2019, for example, the police killed 6,160 civilians. Everybody says that police violence and the killing of people by the police in the United States is very high. Well, in 2019, US was high, it was 933, but it's 6 times less than what it was in Brazil. And over 70% of these killings were Black or brown Brazilians. Again, it has a lot to do with where the police are patrolling, where the police are having their incursions, and what kind of interaction that they're having. And if they're going in with a lot of firepower and ready to shoot, then that's indicative of the police operations in Brazil. This is a table that was put together to really sort of alert people to what is it that we're talking about. You know, there's this discussion in the media, and especially from last year, about Black genocide in Brazil. And so part of what we're talking about is how the police target Afro-Brazilians much more than they target white Brazilians. And so if you look at all of murdered victims, out of every 100 murder victims, there's 75 of them are Black. And when they say Black, they're putting together Black and brown. And then, as I showed you before, between 2007 and 2017, you had an increase, 33.1% increase in Black victims of homicide, whereas you only had a 3.3 increase in non-Black homicides, which goes back to that graph that I showed here, where there was almost goes back to this graph here, where there was almost no change in white homicide and a very large change in Black homicide. Black people only represent 34% of the police force in Brazil, but they're 51.7% of the police officers that are murdered. Deaths resulting from police interventions, 75% of the victims were Black. There's more violence, there's more female victims of rape that are Black. Black women suffer more harassment. And so there's a discussion. And then 67% of women victims of feminicide. And so that's murder of a woman because she was a woman. Between 2017 and 2018 were Black. So on that happy note, one of the things that I'd like to conclude about, and so we have this discussion, and there's discussions about police reform and discussions about how are the police interacting with different communities, and how can we change this dynamic. Unfortunately, we have two different discourses happening. We have a discourse looking at the unfair treatment of Afro-Brazilians by the police, and there are a lot more documentation and registry of these sorts of incidents of just general harassment, of interaction, and that's changing the discourse a bit. However, there still is a very strong discourse in Brazil about we need to have a hard line against crime, and that people who commit crimes need to be killed. And that is a discourse that the current federal administration is very heavily invested in. In fact, the federal administration has worked very hard in liberalizing the gun laws with the argument that Brazilians need to protect themselves because there's a very high crime rate. And so you have two different competing narratives. You have a narrative that recognizes discrimination and unfair police practices and works for that. And then, but then on the other hand, you also have this narrative that is driven by fear of crime and incorporates a lot of stereotypes about who are the criminals and what, and what should be done with the criminals. So those are the two narratives that really are at play when you look at inequalities in the criminal justice system. And to finish, I'd just like to reiterate that Brazilian society is multiracial, multi-ethnic, and that this current composition, being multiracial, multi-ethnic, you can't really understand it without understanding some of the historical and cultural antecedents, which are the things that you've been looking at with these different presentations. And so the colonial period and the way that the Portuguese set up the administration of Brazil as a colony, it's very important to understand how Brazilian politics and governance is still affected. Brazil has done no work in studying, appreciating, coming to terms with their heritage of slavery. If you think that the United States still has a lot of work to do, Brazil has not even begun to look at this. There are no museums, there's no historical discussion, strongly put, in looking at what are the impacts of slavery, how widespread was it, how long did it take. There are beginning to be some studies of this in schools, but there's been very little reckoning of what that all has meant. And then the other two things that I'd like to point out, and these are things that I pointed out in the beginning, have to do with the industrialization process that happened very, very quickly in Brazil over a time period of about 50 years or less than 50 years in the early part of the 20th century, and how that really changed the migratory patterns and the density of the cities, and how the impact of public policy. So we could see, for example, that in the beginning of the 20th century, without any public policies really to deal with the impacts of migration in terms of the increase in the cities, in housing situations, you had different ways that the cities dealt with that in different configurations, urban configurations, and how the impact of public policies, especially in the first decade of the 21st century, were used to ameliorate some of these inequalities that had been growing since the 1970s and 1980s. And so, not to say that public policies or government intervention is the solution to things, but we can't discount that the impact of public policies in terms of increasing access or not, or keeping people from access. So if you look at, for example, what are the public policies versus with housing, and how does that impact urban development? What are the impact of public policies in terms of wealth transfer or in terms of access to education, and how does that change the composition of the society, and how does that change some of the structural inequalities? So these are sort of the four historical cultural antecedents that I think that need to be in play for us to really understand where Brazilian society is today and where Brazilian society can be going. And I think that it will be really interesting to look at data in the next 5 years to get a better sense of, first, what was the impact of the recession in Brazil? And then secondly, I think that the next 5-7 years of data are really going to show us what are the longer term impacts of the pandemic. And so it'll be interesting to see in terms of the age pyramid, in terms of the inequality indexes, in terms of the interactions with the educational labor market and the criminal justice system, how all of these factors are going to play out in the next, I would say, 5 to 7 years. I'm one of these people that wants to study the pandemic in about 5 years and not right now, because right now I think that the questions that I have about long-term effects can only be seen in a few more years. So that's the end of my presentation, and I will open it now to questions.
Excellent, Professor. That was a very nice lecture. Thank you very much for the insights. And we have many questions, actually. So I'm going to try to put them together. Me and Marcus, we're going to try to put some together to see if we can answer as many as possible, especially because some of them have the same, like the same topic, the same approach, the same subject. So that might be helpful so that we can address all of them. So we have Rodrigo from the law school at UFMG, and he asks, which are the available tools to foster the human development of areas which suffer from regional disparity, like the North and Northeast? And I think he's talking about Belo Horizonte. And also we have Abelardo from Turkey.
Wait a minute, Luciana, could you just repeat that? Could you repeat that? What is the what?
Sure.
What are the what?
Which are the available tools to foster the human development of areas which suffer from regional disparity, like the North and the Northeast. Okay, and then Abelardo from Turkey. How high is the social dispute in areas like this? And does it end up increasing the criminality?
How high is the social what?
Dispute. The social dispute.
How high is the social dispute?
In areas like this, like the ones you showed, which have this great difference between the rich and the poor living side by side. And does it end up increasing the criminality rate as means of fighting for leisure spaces, for example, like the park? If yes, is the government concerned about it?
Okay, so those two. What are the available tools? Well, there are certain public policies that have to do with wealth transfer that have been immensely useful in the North and the Northeast, where the poverty rates have been very, very high. Those have continued, and those have been augmented recently with some of the auxiliary emergency stimulus that was made available in the pandemic. The other thing has been, there have been some public works projects. For example, the transposition of the San Francisco River, which was supposed to open up a lot more irrigation and a lot more farming in the North and the Northeast. So there have been some larger projects to deal with disparities on those regions. But there still is a lot of differences in terms of inequality for those regions, because those regions, even though they have some commodity richness, they don't have as much investment in terms of financial and the commercial sector, and now the technological centers. So that's the first one. And then the second one, when you're talking about how high is the social dispute, one of the things that's interesting, there's a theory in the United States that a lot of my colleagues that study crime here in Belo Horizonte have looked at a lot, which has to do with social organization. And this argument that if you have shared values and consensus and contact between neighbors, then that's going to create a community where you kind of police yourselves. And then that's going to be areas that have less crime. And so one of the measures that they always look at are the social capital among neighbors. So do the neighbors talk to each other? Do they ask for favors? Do they help each other out? Are there neighborhood associations? And you know, is the city present at all? And one of the things that we found out is when we were looking at these measures to look at, say, Belo Horizonte and crime in Belo Horizonte, the areas that had the highest crime had all of these, you know, the neighbors knew each other, they owned their homes, they went to barbecues together, they helped each other out, there was neighborhood associations, there was all this social capital. And so then we were like, well, what's going on? Are they wrong? Why is there still crime rates? And we found two things in the case of Belo Horizonte. One of the things was drug trafficking, and not only drug trafficking, but also urban youth gangs that had decided that certain areas were territorially theirs, and then they would protect these areas very, very violently. And so areas where you had either drug trade, gangs that were dealing drugs, or you had these territorial gangs, it didn't really matter how much social capital and some of the other social cohesion, you didn't have that. And linked up with that, you had this idea. And then the other thing that we found was, beyond that, those neighborhoods that had less access to city services, or the residents felt that they couldn't call in the city to fix the pipes, or they couldn't call in the police to handle a dispute, or they didn't feel connected to the state apparatus of control, were also areas that had more crime. So we had to sort of mix that up a little bit. So what we typically find, and so like for example, in Santa Lucia, and that image that I showed where you've got, the high rises and the favela next to each other, the criminality in the actual park area isn't really so much. What you have in those areas, you do have some youth gangs that territorially control those areas and defend them violently. But it's not so much that it's one neighborhood against the other. There's a lot of fear of crime and stereotypes that people that live in more developed areas of the city have towards the lesser developed areas of the city. One neighborhood, for example, Serra, I did some research in the neighborhood of Serra, which is a neighborhood that's in the center east, and it's right next to, so you have sort of a upper middle class neighborhood, and then it's right up against like the hillside, and then on the hillside you have another neighborhood called Aglomerado da Serra. And I was doing some focus groups and some interviews with this neighborhood to try and figure out what their perception of crime was, because they had very low crime rates. When you looked at it objectively, looked at police reports, they had very low crime rates. But they were very worried, and they're like, oh no, all the crime, it comes from Aglomerado da Serra. These people come down and then they steal from us. And so there's a lot of stereotypes about this, that crime comes from other places. And we actually found that in other areas, even low income areas. And we said, oh, well, the crime rate, it's these other kids who come from the other neighborhood, and they come in and they sell drugs to our kids. So that's sort of a very common refrain, that the crime problem isn't endogenous. It doesn't come from within. It's people coming in, and creating problems. And you see a lot of that sort of tension in these spaces where you have marked differences in social stratification that are very, very close together.
Excellent, Professor. Thank you very much for your answer. Mark, please.
Thank you, Professor. I also trying to gather 3 questions. The first is from Ursula Dahmen from University of Münster in Germany. And her question is, how does the right to the city affect the urban development of the cities? And then you have a question from Lara Proes from Queen Mary University of London in the UK. And the question is, do you believe that the concentration of the population in urban areas might have an impact on the resources available to the population as a whole? And then we have Adele Simoni from University of Bologna in Italy. I believe the question is related to Belo Horizonte specifically. And is there any urban planning now from the municipal government?
Okay. So when you're talking about the right to the city, are you talking about Are you talking about where people can go, or are you talking about a specific, because we have the Estatuto da Cidade, which talks about the different rights that people have and, what their housing obligations are and so forth. So I'm not really sure what this person means by right of the city affecting urban development. Maybe I can answer it with the last question, talking about what is the urban planning for the municipality. In Belo Horizonte, there is an organ of the city that deals with urban planning. And there is all sorts of discussion regarding, for example, how to incorporate communities that are occupied communities and how do those get incorporated in. There's a discussion about how to deal with homeless people, and then there are planning that happens. So, for example, we had a few situations where we had great events. So Carnival in Belo Horizonte has become a very big party, or at least it was from 2019. When I first moved to Belo Horizonte in 2003, Belo Horizonte is where you came if you didn't want to do anything for Carnival. It was dead. There was nothing. And now it's become a very big street party. And so there's a lot of work with the city to manage big events. And so they manage, where the routes go, how that's affecting people, what's the sanitation situation going to be like. And so in that, I think that the city does a very good job working with these sort of great events. Where it's doing less of a job, where I think there is some urban planning but needs to improve, are certain things with infrastructure. For example, what is the impact of the rains that we have every single year, and and the flooding that comes with that, and that seems to happen every single year, and it always happens in the same areas. However, there seems to be a difficulty to get some sort of urban policy that actually changes that or fixes the infrastructure so that that is lessened over time. But in terms of occupations and urbanization, I think there are some projects that are working very well. In terms of concentration in urban areas that impact resources, yes, most definitely. However, since over 80% of almost 90% of Brazil is urban, and has been for about the past 20, 30 years, there's a, I think that the impact on resources has been relatively stable, in the sense that we haven't had huge city growth the way we had in the beginning of the 20th century in the last 30 years. And so in terms of what our city populations are, they remain pretty steady. In fact, our larger cities are losing population to the middle-sized cities. What is becoming very evident, however, is that the environmental what happens environmentally in other regions of Brazil has a direct impact on other regions. And I'll give the most glaring example right now. 2019 and 2020, we've had very, very high levels of deforestation in the Amazon. Deforestation levels in the Amazon do not only impact that region, they impact the amount of condensation that is released from the Amazon. That affects the amount of clouds we have. That affects the rainfall that happens in the center and the southeast of the country. Because because of these high levels of deforestation, we currently have a drought where we've had much less rainfall. Brazil depends very, very heavily on hydroelectric power. So currently, the fact that we've had no rainfall or much lower levels of rainfall means that the dams that power our hydroelectric power are very, very low. And so potentially, Brazil will face an electrical shortage in December, January, February because of this. And so in that way, just as we're learning in all kinds of other situations across the globe, things that happen to the environment in one place, they have a butterfly effect, they have a ripple effect in other areas. And so all of this talk about, oh, it's no big deal, Brazil can do whatever it wants with the Amazon, it's ours to exploit. Well, that has consequences, and that has a consequence beyond just the loss of actual vegetation in that region. So that would be one example.
It was excellent. Professor, I would like to ask one last big question. And also I would like to tell everyone, there are many questions about race. And I'm not going to address them to you because tomorrow we're going to have Professor Cristiano, who is going to talk about race in Brazil more specifically. So I guess we could ask you questions that would not be answered tomorrow, for example. and especially they're especially concerned about the census. Victoria from the University of Kent in the UK, she says that despite the pandemic, they carried out a census in March in the UK. Brazil is obviously a much larger country, but she's wondering if there is any government reluctance to have a census. Another question asking about if the indigenous tribes are reluctant to participate in the census, how these people are accounted for. And so could you just, in these very last few minutes, you would address the census issue?
Yes, in a word, yes, there is for government reluctance. This government in particular has been very, very hostile to data. When the National Institute of Space showed satellite data of deforestation, the federal government argued that that was the that it was the satellites were wrong. There is no deforestation. When numbers come up from the our Census Bureau, because they do a series of, they don't just do the census, they do all kinds of different surveys and different data collection. Anytime the numbers have come up and they are perceived to reflect poorly on the government, then the numbers are wrong. So this government in particular is very, very hostile to objective data collection. And it goes beyond the presidency. In fact, the economic minister was questioning why there needed to be so many questions in the census, why they had to know all these things, that it was irrelevant, and couldn't you just do the census cheaper? Which is very, very frustrating because the Census Bureau has done a very good job. They have very good procedures about how to reach everyone. There are very specific procedures about how to reach the indigenous population. The indigenous population is well counted.
They suggested doing the census online, right, Professor? Which is something so
there was
absurd.
a suggestion to do the census online, which would mean that probably 60–70% of the country would not have access to the census. I have been in Brazil every year for the census since 2000, and I was counted every single time. And in 2000, I was living in a favela and they knocked on my door. And in 2010, I was here in Belo Horizonte and they knocked on my door. It's not a lack of know-how. It was very much a lack of resources that were put towards the census. The resources were not put toward the census, or were not put toward the census in time in 2020. And then there was about 2 billion that they needed for the census, and or 3 billion, and they cut it down. They said, okay, we could probably do it for about 2 billion. And I think the census was given 50 million. And I actually now, one of my dear colleagues, one of our colleagues, Rodrigues, is now head of the Census Bureau, Eduardo Rios Neves, who is an economics professor at UFMG. He's now part of the census. And I'm glad that he's there, although many people were like, oh, why are you going over to the dark side? And I have a different perspective of that I think that qualified people, if they can stomach it, need to be part of this government. to
Yes,
sort
we
of
need
keep
them
our
there,
hands
right?
on the
We need them
wheel.
there.
We desperately need him there. I don't know how long he will last because there's a definite hostility of this government to science in general. It's the only country, we have a very, very strong tradition of research, and especially scientific and medical research. And it probably is the only country in the world trying to test and produce vaccines that is having a reduction in government investment in the university system. So we've had a reduction in research and development over the past 2 years, as opposed to other countries like the United States that threw tons and tons of money at the problem in terms of research. We have 2 vaccines that are being tried. One of them is being developed in Urbanisation. The federal government did not guarantee the funds. The city came up with 15 million reais to guarantee second and third wave testing. So yes, it's most definitely government reluctance. They don't see the point in spending the money on these things. And fortunately, the Supreme Court, after they said they're not going to do the census, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, wait a minute, you have to do the census. It's in the Constitution. It's not in the Constitution. It's a vital part of the government. It has to be done. And so now there's a discussion about how that's going to go into the 2022 budget. And so
But if you don't know where's the problem or what is the problem, then there is no problem, right, Professor? That's how it goes.
That's part of the issue. That's part of the issue is that, unfortunately, that there's a saying in English that ignorance is bliss. And I have a feeling that that's part of what's moving that. Unfortunately, all of us that want information so that we can study it, so that we can, propose solutions to problems, are being left a little bit out in the cold with the census.
Yeah.
But I'm always optimistic, and I'm very hopeful. I think that the census, this administration will not last forever.
Yes.
We don't.
Fortunately, nothing lasts forever, right?
So it will not last forever. So so we'll just sort of hold tight. But I have a feeling that we will actually have the census done, because in 2020 they had actually done all of the prep work.
Okay.
So in 2020 the census was actually postponed, but they had done all of the census listing, and they had done some of the block listing. So they had begun to do the groundwork for the census, because in order to be able to actually go to somebody's house, you have to know how many houses are in a certain area, and you have to break down Brazil into different areas and so forth. And they had done all of this previous work.
That's nice.
And they actually were at the point where they wanted to hire the people who were actually going to go and do the census. But that's when the budget didn't approve. And it wasn't just the federal government, because Congress also said, okay, that's fine. So Congress signed off on no budget for the census. So you can't throw everything at the feet of the president.
Well, yeah, I know. Well, Professor, I'm sorry to hear that, but we're very glad to hear you speak. And your lecture was so insightful. Thank you very, very much. We are always honored to have you with us in our Summer School in Brazilian Studies. And on behalf of the Office of International Affairs of Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, I would like to thank you. I would also like to convey Professor Davson Lopes, our Deputy Dean of International Affairs, greetings. And also our Professor Lucas Lima, who is the coordinator for the Summer School in Brazilian Studies. He would also like to thank you for your presence here with us, and hope to see you in person, face to face next year, right? After this all over. Yes, and it's so nice being together, right? At WFMG, at the campus. So thank you very much once again. Thank you guys for your presence. Maybe you might want to open up your video camera so we can have a group picture. And we can see everyone's faces. So different places, different faces, different styles. And it's always so nice to see you all here with us. And in a few minutes, right, Marcos, we have Portuguese classes in.
Yes, that's right, Luciana.
Perfect. And don't forget, at 2 p.m. Brazilian time, we are going to know a little bit more about Inhotim, our museum, our open air museum and botanical garden at 2 p.m. Okay, thank you very much once again, and I'll see you in a while. Bye-bye. Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.